And the world's worst coronavirus outbreak is set to stretch the already strained budgets of Indian states. This as Prime Minister Narendra Modi's federal government suddenly made them responsible for inoculating most adults from the 1st of May. Recently, we spoke exclusively to the Punjab Finance Minister, Manpreet Singh Badal, and he's from the opposition Congress party, describing the crisis as the single biggest failure of the union government since India became independent.
In India, we have a Byzantine bureaucracy, and everything gets stuck over there. So overall, it's been quite a colossal failure.
Well, let's get a reaction to that and discuss on the ongoing crisis. And joining us now is Jay Panda, National Vice President of the ruling party, the BJP. He's also in charge of two regions, Assam and the national capital. Jay, thank you very much indeed for joining. How do you respond to what the Finance Minister of Punjab and what he said?
Well, first of all, I think there's a factual error that needs to be corrected. It's not a sudden decision by the Prime Minister that the states should also be tackling COVID. In fact, health is a state subject in our federal constitution. But of course, the national government has been doing enormous work. And even today on the vaccines, fully 50% of the vaccinations are being funded by the union government. Now, I just want to say that this the second surge has been a humbling experience because of the ferocity and the differences. Unlike the first 14 months in which the government of India took enormous early steps and had a national lockdown, despite a big economic cost and jobs being affected, we did bring the pandemic under control. India had the best numbers in terms of fatalities and infections. Now, the second surge, we have aspects such as fatalities occurring before even the initial test reports come back of patients. And although we had been preparing for an oxygen shortage, the kind of speed at which patients need to go on oxygen has been quite a stunning experience. And we've had different experiences. So, for example, this surge is not a nationwide surge. The vast majority of the new cases come from less than 10 states, including Mumbai and Delhi, which are major metropolitan areas. But fortunately, with immense effort across the board by both union and state governments and many others, I think we seem to be, the cases seem to have plateaued over the past few weeks.
We'll come to that in a second, Jay, but your Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, was very bullish in January, telling the World Economic Forum, and I quote, that he and his compatriots had saved humanity from a big disaster by containing corona effectively. Then there was evidence from various epidemiologists that there was a second surge coming and coming very soon, but the party continued with their hustings in West Bengal and other places. And on top of that, we had them give the green light for millions of people to attend religious festivals. What went wrong?
So I think these are important questions that need addressing. It's not just the Prime Minister who thought that we had overcome the biggest ravages of corona. The consensus in India by early January was that we had done so. Many of the people who are today criticizing, many of the epidemiologists who are today criticizing are on the record back in October saying that the worst was over and that we should not have as many restrictions that we do have. And the fact that India has done enormous work is not just the Prime Minister talking about it. Look at how the world has responded to India's efforts. Recently, President Macron of France lauded India for the kind of work we had done. So the reality is, throughout last year, we had these severe restrictions, and the cases came down to just a trickle by the turn of the year. And by the beginning of the year, if you look at the newspaper reports, if you look at even opposition members in India and international agencies, there was a general consensus for opening up. And so religious places which had been closed for almost a year began to be opened up in the first week of January, and outdoor festivals were gradually, cautiously allowed to happen until the surge happened, and again there has been a crackdown. But the reality is, and also you mentioned hustings. That's not a party decision. In fact, this is decided by an independent election commission of India. And in 5 states, you had the tenures coming to an end. We would have had a constitutional crisis if you did not have elections. But 2 things here. First of all, the surge has not happened in the states that went to elections. They happened in places like Mumbai and Delhi, which had no religious gatherings, no elections. And secondly, when the Election Commission last year decided to have only virtual rallies, we, the BJP, fully supported it, but every other political party said it would kill democracy. And so that was a decision taken keeping in mind all other political parties' desires.
Jay, there's been lots of criticism about a leadership vacuum, that there's been a lot of indifference from the part of Prime Minister Modi. What do you make of that? Why are the people left to look for their oxygen? Why are they left to go from hospital to get help?
So I think there is some kind of a focused narrative that tries to put everything at the foot of Mr. Modi. But the reality is, the early steps that we took, from January 2020, the Prime Minister set up a high-level group to monitor. So we took very early steps for travel restrictions. We took very early steps to boost our medical infrastructure. We took very early steps for producing and rolling out vaccines, which is why we have today the world's largest rollout of vaccines with well over 200 million vaccinated. And we have been able to help 80 other nations with medicines and vaccines. Now, the reality about the oxygen is, as I explained, we have had, the oxygen crisis really has been limited to just 3 or 4 places in India. So last year, the Modi government anticipated this and funded the setting up of new oxygen plants across the country. But being a federal nation, the actual implementation has to happen through the local state governments. And we had differences. For example, as you mentioned, I'm in charge of Assam and Delhi. In Assam, all 8 oxygen plants funded by the union government were put up. But the Delhi government could manage to put up only 1 oxygen plant out of the 8 or so that it had been allotted. So there were differences across the country.
Jay, some say that this is perhaps a wake-up call for India. I mean, India's been spending about only 1% of its GDP on healthcare. Is that likely to change? And simply because the 1% of GDP has been stuck there for about a decade.
You're right that traditionally India had not spent enough, but we have started boosting that very, very dramatically. So over the course of the last 1 year, when this pandemic began about 16, 17 months ago, India was very deficient in terms of hospital beds that could be dedicated to COVID, in terms of PPE kits, in terms of ventilators. So there has been a huge boost. Today, we are one of the world's largest manufacturers in terms of PPE kits or ventilators. So there's been a great improvement. But of course, we need to sustain it. This is not the case across the board. So, for example, in vaccines, India has been rolling out a huge amount of vaccines. In terms of investment in oxygen, which we talked about a little earlier, there's no shortage across the country. It's a question of logistics. Many, many states have huge surpluses of oxygen. Those which have had shortages, like Delhi, have had local logistical issues. But you're right, in terms of what we need to do for the health infrastructure of the country. Remember that Prime Minister Modi has rolled out the world's largest health insurance scheme. And this is applicable in about 90% of the country. Again, as a federal nation, it is dependent on the few states that haven't adopted it to actually do so.
Jay, there are lots of questions being raised about this new particular variant and how vaccines have the right efficacy against it. That's one part of it. But there are many people, also epidemiologists, suggesting there could be a third wave where this virus could be even worse. What are your thoughts on that, and what are you doing about a potential third wave here? I know that we're not even through the second one.
I think that's a very important question. So let's analyze how the second wave happened. So it is not true that everybody was universally predicting a second wave. As I said, many people are on the record as saying that it's over, we should relax. Epidemiologists even, and certainly economists and opposition politicians today, they are contradicting themselves. Same thing about the third wave. If you look at the predictions today in India, you're getting predictions all over the place. Now, we have to take rational decisions based on the information available at the moment. Now, we can't shut down the entire country in a nationwide lockdown like last year, when the second wave is not nationwide. So similarly, for the third wave, we can make preparations. We are, for example, scaling up the hospital infrastructure, number of beds, ICUs, number of ventilators, oxygen, local logistics of oxygen in every state. Now, but we cannot lock down the entire country in one of the possibilities being that there will be a third wave. But the biggest bet, of course, we are making is that our vaccination rollout has been scaled up enormously. We have had to be a little less generous than we were a few months ago with exporting vaccines because of the dramatic increase in requirement in India. So the scaling up of the vaccination production and implementation is going to see very dramatic rises within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And by the end of the year, we hope to have a majority of Indians vaccinated. Now, in between, if a third wave happens, we will have to take steps as the information comes in.